So what I want to do today with you with this is take you through the structure of this piece, because it is a gigantic work, because it occupies a whole concert worth of material. And Mahler was pretty clear about the fact that it was supposed to be a whole concert. Conductors who tried to put other music on the program with that piece, Mahler was always pretty skeptical, and he said, look, this, it's a big piece. It covers a lot of ground, and it's really worth having by itself on a program. Because it's such a big piece, I want to talk through the various sections, and then I'm going to talk you through each movement of the piece as well. So this symphony, this giant symphony, is structured in 5 movements, or 5 different segments. The first one is Allegro Maestoso. This is the Totenfeier, or the funeral rites, and this is the piece that he wrote as a standalone work. It's about 25 minutes long, and it's one large funeral. There's a funeral march in there, and there's a funeral ceremony in there, and there are ideas about death, and a lot of the ideas that are going to carry through the symphony are all included in that first movement. The second movement is shorter. It's about 10 minutes, and it's an andante moderato. It's a slower movement, and it's based on dance forms. It's much lighter. It's not nearly as dark and stormy and powerful as the first movement. The third movement is a scherzo, Die Welt wie im Hohlspiegel, the world as in a concave mirror. And it's also much lighter than the first movement. The second and third movements are much lighter. They are much more of that folk influence that Robin spoke of, the Czech influence and the German Ländler folk music influence. Then we have the fourth movement, which is called Urlicht, which means primeval light. And this is a little song. It's a 5-minute movement, and which is funny, the proportion of a 5-minute movement in this symphony of large scales. It's a song from Des Knaben Wunderhorn, the youth's magic horn folk poems that Mahler had set prior to writing the symphony. And then we go to the finale, the apocalyptic vision. And the finale is huge. It's 35 minutes long. And the finale itself, one movement, is as long as Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So it's a large work. Interestingly, because of the time lag between the composition of the first movement and then the second, third, fourth, and fifth movements of 3 years, there's a real stylistic shift between the first and second movements. And Mahler was concerned about this stylistic shift. And so he calls for something very unusual, perhaps unique, in the symphonic repertoire, which is at the end of this first stormy movement, this funeral rites, he makes a little notation in the score to the conductor that says, at the end of this movement, you are to take a pause of at least 5 minutes before proceeding to the second movement, which is a strange thing to say. Take a pause of at least 5 minutes. And so I elect to take a short intermission, not a full-length intermission, but take a short intermission and let people's ears kind of clear out. Another story about the San Francisco Symphony, my principal trumpet player for my other orchestra, the North State Symphony, went to San Francisco State in the 70s, and that was when Seiji Ozawa was conducting the San Francisco Symphony. And Brian went to see a performance of Mahler's Second Symphony, and Seiji had a chair set up right next to the podium. And so when he finished the first movement, he got off the podium, sat down, it's being broadcast, I better stay in the mic, sat down in the chair, looked at his watch, faced the audience, crossed his arms, and just sat for 5 minutes, looked at his watch, stood back up, got up on the podium, and went on with the piece. And he said the audience just sat there saying, what on earth is he doing here? And I think that disruption actually goes a little bit against what Mahler was asking for in this. But part of what precipitated Mahler's decision to do that was, at one of the early performances, Debussy and Dukas and Dandy, 3 of the great French composers of this turn of the century, came to see a performance of Mahler's Second Symphony. They sat through the first movement, found it to be very powerful. The second movement started, and about halfway through the second movement, they felt that this just did not live up to the first movement, and they got up and walked out, which really hurt Mahler. He was actually pretty upset by this. And so he wrote a letter to one of his friends and said, I know that the second movement doesn't quite fit with the first movement, but it's too late. I've already written them, and I don't want to go back and change it. And so that's why he put this pause in there. So there are certain thematic ideas that Mahler wrote into the first movement that he carried through to the end of the symphony that have extra musical meaning or meaning as part of this dramatic program. And so I want to go through these themes before I walk you through each of the movements, and knowing these themes, you will have a lot greater understanding of what's happening throughout this piece. And Mahler uses these themes in a really interesting way. The themes are really musical building blocks. And those building blocks are based on symbols or musical symbolism that stand for certain concepts in here. And it creates a real unity of construction in this piece. So even though it's this giant 80-minute long work, it's not random or haphazard. It doesn't wander. It's very tightly wound together. And the themes actually provide a dramatic subtext for the piece. And if we think back again to the things that Robin was talking about, the social and philosophical ideas that were propagating, and with Freud and in Vienna, subtext was one of the very important ideas, this idea of a meaning that was beneath the surface. And so Mahler uses these ideas as a musical subtext. And the first one, the important one, is the cross motif. And you'll see that up at the top. It doesn't matter if you can't read music. I'm going to play some examples so that you can hear them. And the cross motif is one that Mahler did not himself invent. It was actually sort of invented by Franz Liszt. And there are sort of musicological tricks as to why these particular notes, these three notes, represent the cross. But Mahler chose to use this cross motif kind of pervasively through the symphony, and takes that cross and turns it later on into the resurrection motif. Now, Robin mentioned that Mahler was a non-observant Jew. He converted to Catholicism really for the job. He never was an observant Catholic either. I mean, he seemed to be actually religiously unaffiliated, but that didn't mean that he wasn't interested in a lot of the ideas behind a lot of the world religions. In fact, he said when he was writing this piece, he scoured all the world's books and couldn't come up with anything, so he wrote his own text. And so, out of all the world books, nothing really expressed what he was going to say, but he did want to express these ideas of resurrection and did rely on Christian symbolism, certainly. So the cross motif that I'm going to play moves into the resurrection motif, which then moves into the eternity motif, which then touches the dies irae, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment, before it goes on into a new section. So I'm going to play the first example that I'm going to play here, uses all three of those. It's this section that you see, it measures 282 to 290 there. And you'll hear the cross motif, the resurrection motif, the eternity motif, and then the dies irae. Gloria, if you're back there, can you turn our volume up a little bit? We're turned down. I'd like to get it a little bit louder. The eternity motif is very important because when we get to the end of the symphony, we're going to hear that's then going to morph into the ascension motif. And so we're kind of constantly moving from these fate motifs and through the cross motif, through the resurrection motif, to the eternity motif. And let's hear a little bit of that right now. Okay. Now, the dies irae is an ancient hymn tune. It's a 13th century hymn tune that comes out of the Catholic tradition, and it is part of the Mass that is said for the dead. And it has a particular melody, dee-ta, dee-ta, dee-ta-tam, that you can see up. That's actually one of the texts from I think the maybe 14th or 15th centuries, but shows the dies irae. And it's been used many times by many, many different composers whenever they're dealing with death. And a couple of the good examples of that would be Berlioz in his Symphony Fantastique uses quotes from the dies irae. I think in the Danse Macabre there's the dies irae, and then of course many composers wrote their own version of the dies irae. If you heard the Juno Symphony's Verdi Requiem or the Mozart Requiem, you know, we did the dies irae in there as well. And so Mahler borrows this directly and uses the dies irae in a number of different forms to signal to the audience, whether you know it or not, to signal to the audience that we're talking about the final judgment, the day of wrath. And you heard that in the horns, and it's going to come back in all sorts of different configurations here. There are a couple other things that we're going to hear over and over again. One of them is we call the fright fanfare, and this is the moment that woke Robin up in San Francisco all those years ago. And this it's sort of a scream, and so we call it the fright fanfare, and it's supposed to wake you up, but it's a call of agony or the dying person's cry out, and it sounds like this. That's the fright motif. Just a couple more here. The resurrection motif comes from the cross motif. So I'm going to play that for you so you can hear a little bit of that, and then that is going to turn into the choral entrance that's where Robin totally broke down in that earlier performance. So we're going to hear the resurrection motif here. And you can hear that. I mean, he even plays it in the trumpets, which brings us the cross motif in the first place. And then that turns into the first entrance of the chorus, where they sing Auferstehen, ja, auferstehen. Rise again, yes, rise again. And that's the root of the resurrection idea here. So let's talk about the first movement here. The first movement is the giant movement of the funeral rites, and this is what Mahler wrote in one of his program notes. We stand by the coffin of a person well loved. His whole life, his struggles, his passions, his sufferings, and his accomplishments on earth once more for the last time pass before us. And now, in this solemn and deeply stirring moment when the confusions and distractions of everyday life are lifted like a hood from our eyes, a voice of awe-inspiring solemnity chills our heart. A voice that, blinded by the mirage of everyday life, we usually ignore. What? What is life and what is death? Why did you live? Why did you suffer? Is it all nothing but a huge, frightful joke? Will we live on eternally? Do our life and death have a meaning? We must answer these questions in some way if we are to go on living, indeed, if we are to go on dying. He into whose life this call has once sounded must give an answer, and this answer I give in the final movement. So he even sets up that he is asking the question about death. What is death? Why does it happen? And that he's going to strive over the course of this symphony to answer that question by the time we get to the last movement. I should mention that there was an event that precipitated Mahler's finishing this symphony. He had written the first movement, and one of his friends, the great conductor von Bülow, died 3 years later, and Mahler went to the funeral for von Bülow, and he wrote to Mahler wrote to one of his other friends. He said, "The way in which I received the inspiration for this work is very typical for the nature of artistic creativity. For a long time I had been pondering the idea of including a choir in the last movement of a symphony. Only the fear that this might be considered an overt imitation of Beethoven made me hesitate again and again. When Bülow died, I attended his funeral. The mood I was in as I sat there thinking of the deceased was very much in the spirit of the work I had on my mind at the time. Then from the organ loft, the choir sang Klopstock's chorale Resurrection. This hit me like lightning, and everything appeared clearly and distinctly before me. Every creative artist waits for that stroke of lightning. It is a kind of holy conception." So the death of his friend von Bülow and hearing the choir sing Resurrection prompted him to ask this question and then try to answer the question. So the first movement itself, the symphony is in 5 sections. The first movement itself is in 5 sections. And those 5 sections are the exposition, where we hear the funeral march, a lyric theme, the cross symbol, and more funeral music. Then we have a second section, which is a development, which is introduced, then has a little pastoral, develops the cross symbol, and then returns to the main motives of the first movement. Then we have a second complete development, and this is where that modernist impulse takes hold. So even though Mahler's working in the symphony form, it's not traditional to have 2 developments. So he, rather than proportion in thirds, he really proportions in halves. His exposition in the first development is about half the piece. Then his second development and the recapitulation and the coda are the other half of the piece. The second development starts with a lament, this kind of sad cry, and importantly, anticipates the finale. And it's amazing to me, actually, that he wrote this piece prior to conceiving how this finale was going to work, because the second development includes all of those little motifs that I played you examples of, the Dies Irae theme, the cross motive, the resurrection motive, and the eternity motive. Then we go to a recapitulation, which repeats the material of the exposition, and we have a little coda. And I do want to play for you, even though you've heard all of these themes, I want to play for you the beginning of the first movement, because I think it's one of the most amazing and iconic moments in music, and it's part of what made me fall in love with this piece right away. This is the beginning of the first movement. That's the beginning of the first movement. Kind of frightening. I mean, it's terrifying, really, in the sound. You get that tremolo in the upper strings, and it's the basses and the cellos who play this da-da-da-da-dum. Really neat. The second movement, Mahler writes, "This is a memory, a ray of sunlight, pure and cloudless, out of the departed's life. You must surely have had the experience of burying someone dear to you, and then perhaps, on the way back, some long-forgotten hour of shared happiness suddenly rose before your inner eye, sending, as it were, a sunbeam into your soul not overcast by any shadow, and you almost forgot what had just taken place." And the picture I put up here is by Gustav Klimt, and I like that image because it sort of fits with the idea of the sunlight of this memory. And so because we are remembering happy things, he's really changed the tenor of the piece significantly. And this is a moment where I feel like you have to know his program note, because otherwise it really is jarring after that first funeral march to go into this very happy memory. Otto Klemperer said about this movement, "It's not Schubert, it's a man who remembers Schubert." And there's a big difference. And I think that's a really great description, because it's a nostalgic view back to one of this kind of lighter, folkier sounds. This is a dance-like pastoral movement. It's a very simple rondo form, which really just means repeating different sections with 2 themes and then variations on those 2 themes. And I'll play you the 2 themes so that when you're in the hall listening to it, you'll be able to identify those 2 themes. This is the first theme. I'm struck in these two pictures how much Mahler and Schubert really look alike, too. Maybe I should grow my hair back out again. This is the second theme. And so Mahler just brings us back and forth between those two pretty simple little themes. I do think it's kind of interesting. He talks about variation, and Mahler himself never liked exact repetition. And so he wrote a letter to one of his friends, and he pointed out that as opposed to the Romanticists' ideas of variation, which tended to be strict and very formally based, he considered his own variations to be ornamentations, paraphrases, and entwinements, rather than a subtle following and working through the same cycle of notes. And so his idea, Mahler's idea of variation, is not to just repeat the same idea done a little bit differently, but to actually work from a kernel of idea and change it a bit. So even though we will come back to these ideas in A1 and B1 and A2, they're going to sound a little bit different each time, but you'll be able to identify where those things come through. The third movement, I think, is very interesting and was a little bit puzzling to me, honestly, until I started digging a little bit deeper. Mahler says, when you awaken from that blissful dream of the second movement and are forced to return to this tangled life of ours, it may easily happen that this surge of life, ceaselessly in motion, never resting, never comprehensible, suddenly seems eerie, like the billowing of dancing figures in a brightly lit ballroom that you gaze into from outside in the dark, and from a distance so great that you can no longer hear the music. I think it's interesting that he's representing in music what it's like to not be able to hear the music. Then the turning and twisting movement of the couples seems senseless. You must imagine that to one who has lost his identity and his happiness, the world looks like this, distorted and crazy, as if reflected in a concave mirror. Life then becomes meaningless. Utter disgust for every form of existence and evolution seizes him in an iron grip, and he cries out in a scream of anguish. And that scream of anguish is that fright motif that I played for you earlier, and that's going to come at the end of this movement. Now, this movement actually sounds pretty happy, and it's based on a song, the Sermon of St. Anthony of Padua to the Fishes, which is a poem from Des Knaben Wunderhorn that Mahler set for piano and voice. And in this song, St. Anthony preaches to the fishes after he's found the church empty. And Mahler thinks it's a satire on humanity and a parable of senselessness. And so he considers this whole idea to be kind of funny. And I'm going to play for you the song, a little bit of the song, not a lot of it, but a little bit of the song, so you can hear a singer with piano singing the song. And those of you symphony musicians who are sitting out here, you're going to recognize it, and then for the rest of you, I'll play the clip with the orchestra. This is a little bit of the song, St. Anthony. Gloria, we could still use it a little louder if you're back there. You can turn it up just a little bit more. So the two sections here this is very much in the same form, a little rondo, simple rondo form, like the second movement. It's an A and a B. A sections are based on St. Anthony. The B sections are a folksy dance. They're very much a German Ländler-style dance. Then we come back and repeat A, and then we repeat B again, and this time we end with that scream, that fright fanfare that Mahler has talked about. Let's hear just a little bit of those, just a couple seconds of those A and B sections. So this A section is going to be based right on the song we just heard. Now, remember how Mahler mentioned that life goes on and on and on and on and on? So he's written what is sort of a perpetual motion machine. And that line never really stops throughout this entire scherzo movement. It just keeps going and going and going. The second movement goes into that dance. Oops. Now, one of the things that I find really interesting about this, and I didn't really get until after talking with Robin about modernism, it's always puzzled me a little bit this high and low that we get constantly alternating in Mahler, because the first movement is very, very deep. I mean, it's deep music, it's powerful. I mean, it's out of the tradition of Beethoven, taken to a logical extension, toward the end of the century. Then we get movements like these inner movements that are so simple, that are based on dances that sound very country-like. In fact, in the third movement, there are these sections that sound like klezmer. You can hear kind of the Czech or the Bohemian sounds in there. And I've always been a little bit puzzled, but one of the things that Robin mentioned about this modernism is this idea that there's really no true aesthetic difference between the high and the low, because there's no inherent value difference between types of music. And so in that respect, once again, Mahler is being quite modern in incorporating these things. It does, however, make it in some ways much simpler and easier to hear when we hear these second and third movements. Now we move into the fourth movement, which is, to my mind, the 5 most beautiful minutes of music ever written. And I know that's a strong statement, but I really believe that. Actually, I really do. The fourth movement is the Irrlicht, or Primeval Light. I put another Klimt image up there. Actually, this Klimt image, interestingly enough, was inspired by Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and yet it sort of fits with Mahler's Second Symphony. And all Mahler says about the fourth movement is, the moving voice of naive faith sounds in our ears. I am from God and will return to God. The dear God will give me a light, will light me to eternal blessed life. And I think this is an interesting take on Mahler's personal struggle with the idea of death. Because I think, unlike composers like Mozart or Verdi, who were very solid in their faith, Mahler, more like Brahms, is questioning. But unlike Brahms, Mahler wants to be comforted, and he wants to believe, and that's going to play an important role in the last movement. Mahler said himself about this, the questioning and agonized searching of the soul for God and for its own eternal existence. And I'm going to play just a few seconds here of the Irrlicht from his song cycle for piano and voice and mezzo-soprano. This song, both the piano version and the orchestral version, is in what we call a song form. It has a little introduction, and then it has 3 short stanzas. And each stanza is in a different style because each stanza represents different text. So let's hear just a little bit. This is actually out of the second stanza of the song. This is for piano and voice. Now, this is the only segment that I'm going to play you a larger example, and I'm going to play the whole fourth movement for you because it's only 5 minutes long. And because when you are actually sitting in the auditorium, you're not going to be able to read the translation, see the German and the English together. And so I put them up so you could see the German and read the translation. And so we're just going to listen to this movement in its entirety. It begins with the mezzo-soprano, or the alto soloist. We hear a little chorale in the brass. Then the strings accompany and the winds accompany for the second and third systems. So we're just going to listen to this in its entirety. And then we get the scream, which wakes everybody up. It's just gorgeous. Okay, the fifth movement. We're almost done here. I'll finish up the fifth movement quickly, and then if anybody has to go, they can go, and we'll take some questions too. In the fifth movement, Mahler says, once more we must confront terrifying questions. The movement starts with the same dreadful scream of anguish that ended the scherzo. The voice of the caller is heard, and this is going to be important. The end of every living thing has come. The last judgment is at hand, and the horror of the day of days has come upon us. The earth trembles, the last trumpet sounds, the graves burst open. All the creatures struggle out of the ground, moaning and trembling. Now they march in a mighty procession, rich and poor, peasants and kings. The whole church with bishops and popes, all have the same fear, all cry and tremble alike, because in the eyes of God there are no just men. The cry for mercy and forgiveness sounds fearful in our ears. The wailing becomes gradually more terrible. Our senses desert us. All consciousness dies as the eternal judge approaches. The trumpets of the apocalypse ring out. Finally, after all have left their empty graves and the earth lies silent and deserted, there comes only the long-drawn note of the bird of death. Even it finally dies. What happens now is far from expected. Everything has ceased to exist. The gentle sounds of a chorus of saints and heavenly hosts is then heard. Soft and simple, the words gently swell up. Rise again, yea, you shall rise again. Then the glory of God comes into sight. A wondrous light strikes us to the heart. All is quiet and blissful. Lo and behold, there is no judgment, no sinners, no just men, no great and no small. There is no punishment and no reward. A feeling of overwhelming love fills us with blissful knowledge and illuminates our existence. Now, the last movement is huge, as I mentioned. It's 35 minutes long, and its structure is huge as well. It is in really four main parts. It has an introduction that starts with the Fright fanfare that you all know. Then we hear the Eternity and Ascension themes together. Then we get the announcement of Judgment Day, the one calling in the wilderness. And I think this is really interesting and fun about the piece. The caller who announces the day of judgment comes from the French horns off stage. So somewhere back in the back of the auditorium, somewhere out of sight and barely in hearing, you will hear the horns do this. And this is going to be pretty soft. And it's wonderful because Mahler creates this effect out of all of this noise that occurs, and then it sort of comes down to nothing, and you hear these horns off in the distance calling. There is another idea, and this idea is new to the last movement. It's not included in the other four movements, and that is the section that we call the entreaty, or I call the entreaty. And the entreaty, you will hear when we get to it the third time, is the alto, and she sings the words, O glaube mein Herz, O glaube, which means, O believe, my heart, believe. And so even after all of the rest of what Mahler has done in setting this up, he still comes back to this idea of believe, and he's really saying, help me believe. He's not saying save me, he's saying help me believe. And that is this kind of passionate, asymmetrical motif that's syncopated and kind of constantly shifting, and it sounds like this. Constantly yearning and sort of pathetic dee-da quality to it. Then we get another announcement of the caller, and there's this wonderful moment where the percussionists get to go crazy on stage, and they play all of the instruments they have and rumble as loud as they can, and the idea is that the earth is shaking and the graves are opening up, and when that happens, Mahler takes the Dies Irae and turns it into a march, and this is the march of all of the dead who are processing forward to be judged. the march that he bases on the Dies Irae. Then we get a collapse, the Fright fanfare comes back, we get the entreaty again. Then there's a big climax of the Fright fanfare, and the eternity and ascension theme happens. And when we come around to the recapitulation, where we come back to the main ideas, now we have the great roll call, the true apocalypse. Although in some respects Mahler hedges his bets, because rather than calling it the true apocalypse, he often also calls it the vision of the apocalypse over the final judgment, I think, which also sort of fits into this idea of not being quite into one religious tradition or another. The caller motif, and I'm not going to play the whole thing here for you, comes back with the horns, much stronger this time, and then we hear the trumpets as well. The last trumpet shall sound. And it ends with the bird of death, these little bird call trills that then fade out to absolutely nothing. And I'll just play the beginning of this clip here. We still have a little bit of rumbling in the background. So the trumpets begin to sound, and it goes on like that. I'm going to skip the entreaty right now. You'll hear that when you hear the performance, but I do want to play just a little bit of the end. I'm not going to play the whole conclusion, but this is the variation of the chorus entrance that we played earlier for you in its final climactic glory. Builds up, we get the eternity theme, bells, and then transcendence. This is the end. It's just a magnificent piece. It really is truly a magnificent piece. Just a couple more words on this piece. You know, walking through all of the structure, I think, makes it much more comprehensible in its large form. But I think this is a piece very much like a Shakespeare play. I mean, you can go into Midsummer Night's Dream, you don't have to know anything about it, and you can thoroughly enjoy and get everything about the play. And even with the gigantic structure of the Mahler Second Symphony, Robin and I both had that same experience. You can go into that and just be washed along with what he is writing. And that fits well into the idea of the modernist composer, that he's creating a world in this composition. And it's not just about sort of ripping things out of his soul and putting them on display for the rest of us, that he is actually creating a soul in the creation of this entirety of the world, and that we tune into it and are carried along. And I used to say, before I talked to Robin about this, I used to say, Mahler takes us on a journey, and I still think that's true. He starts us on a journey when that funeral march at the very beginning and the outset, then takes us through the emotions of dealing with the concepts of death and brings us all the way around to this eventual transcendence and resurrection. Thank you very much. We sure appreciate your being here.